we've learned a lot about the basic anatomical position, how we describe the body in three-dimensional space, different planes that go through the body, and different axes that allow us to describe movements along joints. So now let's talk about some of the terminology for those movements. And we'll start with one that everybody's familiar with, flexion and extension. So remember, this is all relative to the anatomical position. So flexion is when we decrease the angle of a joint relative to the anatomical position. Flexion at the elbow. But this is also flexion at the shoulder. We are decreasing the angle at the shoulder joint. And of course, extension is just returning the arm to the anatomical position. Flexion, extension. We sometimes talk about this as hyperextension or extension back. And boy, I'm sure right now all of you have your coach's voice in your head going, I need more extension, I need more extension. We'll actually talk a little bit later about how extension happens anatomically. It's just important to remember or to note that flexion and extension happens around or about this coronal axis that we described, the right to left axis. But it's happening in a sagittal plane. That's something for you to think about. Okay, two more terms, really important for figure skating, although we don't use these terms as much as we do extension and flexion. And that is abduction, and adduction. Abduction and adduction. Okay, so abduction, AB, is the movement of a body part away from the anatomical resting position. So that is AB, abduction of the arm. Adduction, AD, is the movement of the body part back to resting position. Abduction, adduction. So we talked about the axis and the planes for flexion and extension. So when we talk about abduction and adduction, this is occurring in the coronal plane, but it's happening around or about the sagittal axis. So sometimes we want to be thinking about where's the arm moving in space in this coronal plane. Sometimes we want to think about where is that movement anchored in the sagittal axis. This awareness can really help when we're trying to think about skating moves and how we really express those. Okay, rotation, really important. Internal rotation, external rotation. Okay, internal rotation is the rotation of a joint towards the midline. So from the anatomical position, that is internal rotation. Internal rotation. Internal rotation. External rotation is the movement of a joint essentially back to anatomical position. Or if you're really flexible, you can somewhat hyper-rotate past anatomical position. But we talk about internal rotation and external rotation. And much like we described for the other movements, the rotation, the actual movement is occurring in this transverse plane, but it's occurring along or about the longitudinal axis. Okay, of course you can have the same thing happening with the lower limb. You can have external rotation and then internal rotation back to the anatomical resting position. external rotation, internal rotation. And again, I'm sure you can hear your skating coach, turn out, rotate, point the toe. We'll talk about all that in the next session. There are some other unique movements that we see in very isolated parts of the body. So we can talk about depression or depressing. And actually here I'm not talking about the quality of my left forward outside dance 3-turn. That's another story. Depression is where we press the shoulders down. We move them inferiorly. Or we can raise the shoulders, all right? Elevate, depress. And again, we hear our coaches talk a lot about press your shoulders down. Okay, well, how do we actually do that? For another session. The scapula has a unique set of movements that actually we only see with the jaw as well. And that is what we call protraction and retraction. So we can actually push the jaw out and we can pull it back in, protraction and retraction. We can do that with the scapula as well. Like if you're hugging somebody, your scapula actually protract. They go out when you hug them. And when you come back, the scapulas retract. And that awareness of the motion of the scapula can do a lot to your skating. You can actually isolate. You can use one scapula to kind of rotate down. You can use both scapula to pull back. So there's a lot of awareness here about which muscles are doing what and what kind of motion are we talking about. And finally, we'll end with the idea that none of these movements happen in isolation. And so we have names for combinations of movements. So for example, one name for a combination of these different movements is circumduction. Circumduction is a combination of abduction, extension, and rotation. So if you look at those individually, abduction, that's not so exciting, just out and back. Extension, hyperextension or extension back, that's kind of interesting. And then, we've got this rotation going on, which is kind of neat. If you put that all together to circumduct, you get abduction, extension, and rotation, and that can look a lot like what you might do with a really nice bow to end the program. And with that, I, again, want to share how much I admire all of you skaters, especially you adult skaters. If you heard anything that you didn't understand, you want more information on, or if you think I made a mistake, I probably did, please feel free to email me at wehjoh1@gmail.com, or with suggestions for other anatomical topics you'd like to hear about. And I'll just leave you with this. If you are nice to your anatomy, it will be nice to you. Take care, everyone.